Hello everyone, my name's Cole Wehrle and I'm the designer of John Company, and today I'm going to be teaching you all how to play the game. Now, I've taught John Company hundreds of times, and it is an interesting game to teach. It's a little different from other games that I've designed in that you don't actually need to know every rule when you start playing. In fact, my favorite way to teach this game is to have one player at the table have total mastery, understand all the systems, a little bit like a game master in a traditional role-playing game. And the other players, they just need a general overview of what the game is. And during the first turn or turn and a half, the person running the game will kind of introduce everybody to their options and just get them actually playing. The whole structure of this game is actually designed to teach players how to play it while they play it. Now, that may not be the best approach for all groups. Some groups prefer, for instance, to have a big rules dump where every single rule is, or almost every rule is gone over with right at the beginning so that they can understand the implications of their moves. This video is for those groups. If you watch this video and think that your group might prefer more of a rolling start, I would recommend checking out my introduction video and having other members of your group watch that if you don't want to give them an overview of the game yourself. All right, I think we're just about ready to go then. So the last thing I want to mention is that there will be a few parts of the game that I will gloss over. The first one is the general introduction. So I would recommend everybody start with the introductory video, which is about 20 minutes long and provides kind of a general bird's eye picture of the entire game, how some key systems work, the different piece classes, things like that. This video is going to be a fairly fast-paced teach that will hopefully take you through almost every system of the game and explain in detail how it works. Okay, let's get to it. So here we have John Company set up on the table. Now, I won't be going over setup in detail in this video because it's pretty straightforward, and you can find those details in the first couple of pages of the rule book. And if there's demand, I'm happy to do a separate setup video later, but it's honestly pretty simple. Now, I want to just get right into the rules. So, John Company is a procedural game. It lasts between 1 and 5 turns. You don't know exactly how long it's going to last. The game, if you get to the 5th turn, will end always, and then players proceed to final scoring, which is detailed right here. Now, it's possible that the game ends earlier if the company fails. There are 2 ways the company can fail. The first way is if the company's standing falls down to this failure spot. And you can see how the standing is moved by using this little chart. We'll also refer to it later in play. The second way the company can fail is that the company may take debt. When debt fills this track, if ever the debt track is full and another debt needs to be placed, the company fails. Now, the consequences of the company failing are that every share, which is a piece in the court of directors, is worth -1 victory points if the company fails. If the company is successful, shares are worth 1 victory point. The other important consequence is that at the end of the game, final retirement only occurs if players have a successful company. If the company is a failure, there will be no final retirement. Last thing I'll note is that there are 4 scenarios in the game. Most scenarios have a 5-turn length, and the long full campaign scenario has an 8-turn length. It is absolutely recommended that you begin the game with the 1710 scenario. That's all I'm going to be teaching here. The other scenarios add things like the deregulation of the company, private firms, all kinds of other nonsense. So take your time with this one. There is a mountain of game just in the 1710 scenario. All right, now let's talk about the construction of a turn. John Company is a procedural game, which means that every turn is composed of a number of phases, which go through here. And sometimes in those phases, there are sub-rounds where players will take turns. Sometimes those phases happen in a carefully demarcated order. Sometimes there's even some real-time elements. Now, don't get scared when I say real-time elements. They're pretty chill. You're not going to find yourself shouting at each other like you're playing a game of Pit. Okay, so let's start at the top. First, the first phase of the game is the London season. The London season is skipped on the first turn, but after that, it proceeds in the following order. There are 3 subphases we have, or steps. We have attrition and family upkeep, retirement, and prestige cards. Attrition proceeds as follows. Every player will roll 1 die for every office holder that they have. So this family, the Hastings family, has 2 office holders. They will roll a die for each. On a 1 or 2, the office holder is healthy and nothing is done. On a 3 or 4, the office holder becomes fatigued, and a fatigue chip is added to the card. Now, these black chips are contextual pieces, which means they mean different things in different places. If a black chip is added to an office card, it is a fatigue chip. Elsewhere in the game, it could represent a closed order, a regiment, or debt, as we'll talk about later. Now, on a card, when you roll for a retirement, every black chip on the card modifies this roll by 1 more. So the rolls again are 1 to 2, nothing happens. A 3 to 4 adds a black chip, and a 5 or 6 causes this person to retire. When an office retires, the player piece associated with that office, so here we have the Director of Trade, controlled by Blue, the Hastings family, which is also linked to this piece. When the office retires, this piece becomes a pensioner. It's added to the pensioner box. And this office card is flipped over and stacked on the vacant offices deck. This little stack of cards here. All right, now this is done simultaneously. All players roll for their retirees at the same time. There's no order in it. And then we proceed to retirement. Oh, the other thing that happens during attrition is that The other thing that happens during attrition is players pay upkeep. So if they had any family folks out here, they would also have to pay this upkeep value. If they can't pay it, they lose it. So for instance, let's say green was over here at the start of the turn, and while they're rolling for their retirements, they also see that they need to pay a total of 5. If they cannot pay this 5, they lose whatever they can't pay for. So for example, let's say green only had £2. They would have to lose this family member because they weren't able to pay for their castle. So sad. Okay, so that's the expenses and retirement step. After that, we do the that's the attrition and family upkeep step. Now we do the retirement step. The retirement step begins with the chairman. So one player is going to be holding the chairman. They'll get this fancy big pawn to show that they're the chairman player. They go first, and then play proceeds clockwise from them. This is the game's default turn order, and so usually things will begin with the chairman and go from there. Okay, so after the chairman goes, basically what's going to happen is we start with the chairman and then we go clockwise. And when it comes to your turn, you must retire all of your pensioners. Any pensioners that you do not retire get returned to the supply. Now, if you choose not to, I should be very clear what I mean about must retire all of them. Basically, all of your pensioners must retire or be returned to the supply. So this pensioner right here, I can retire. If I choose not to for some reason, it's returned to the supply. The cost of retirement is listed on these prizes. They cost 2 if retired here, 4 here, 8, 14, and 20. You do not need to pay expenses the first turn that they retire. So for instance, Hastings family has £6 here. They could spend 4 of those pounds to retire their person here. After they would do that, they would adjust their victory points up 2 places because this prize is worth 2 victory points. Now, these pieces are going to be double-sided in the actual game, but in this game, because we're on Tabletop Simulator, you should just rotate your pieces to their side for anything that you have just retired. And the reason you do that is because in the 3rd phase of the London season, we get prestige cards. Now, there is going to be a little menu of prestige cards right here. This is called the London display. And the way this works is starting with the player who spent the most money during this phase. So in this instance, blue has spent 4. No one else has spent anything this phase. They are going to get the first draw. And each player only gets 1 draw. Now, this is very important. Doesn't matter how many pieces you chose to retire. You only get a single draw per player, per turn. Okay, so If there is a tie in the amount of money that has been spent, the player with the most total victory points from prizes goes first. So, for example, let's say green was also able to retire a piece here. And so both green and blue spent 4. Well, green has the tiebreaker because they have a lot more money total from prizes than blue does. Any further ties are broken in chairman order. Now, the way this works is when it's your turn to pick a prestige card, you may select any of these 3 cards. If there is a secret prestige card, you are allowed to peek at it. Only when it's your turn to choose. So for example, I could choose this one, and then I would just add it to my play area. No replacement is drawn until the end of this whole phase. So if 4 or more players had pensioners, it's possible that some players would get skipped and they wouldn't get a chance to score a prestige card. Now, prestige cards come in a few different varieties. Some are enterprises, which you see listed here. Enterprises have effects. This rotten borough is worth 2 votes, for instance. Also, you'll see in the top right that it has a little fancy frame with a small image in it. This is a special prestige bonus, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on. Violet Effingham over here, she's worth 3 prestige at the end of the game. She's a spouse. She has a special power, which is an inheritance. You may discard this card and take 3 pounds. So if you don't want this prestige for some reason, you could just use her to take some money. And most everything in this game is tradable, but spouses have the cannot transfer tag on them, which means once you have a spouse, you are stuck with them. Lastly, we have the secret prestige card. Now, when it's my turn to pick, I'm allowed to peek at it, and I'm not compelled to pick it. So even if I don't pick it, I will and somebody else does, because I've peeked at it, I can know what they have. So here is this prestige card. There are 2 varieties. One variety is a blackmail, and I'll find one of those for you all right now. Let's find a blackmail. There's a blackmail. So there are 2 varieties of secret prestige cards. Blackmails right here, which are single-use attack cards, basically. So this, at the start of the London season, before any dice are rolled, you get to pick 1 office holder to retire, then discard. So this basically means at this step, when you were rolling retirement dice, you can just instantly force a person to retire. It can be very effective to use on your own pieces or to dislodge a stubborn office holder. The other kind are hidden interests. These cards, at the end of the game, will offer you additional victory points. So this one says if you have the most prestige from deeds at the end of the game, you get 4 victory points. Now, these cards are also transferable. Other players are welcome to peek at them if you give them permission. And if maybe you don't want this card because you don't have the most prestige from deeds, so it's not worth anything to you, you could auction it off. Heck, you could flip it over for the whole table to see and auction it off just to earn some money. So there are lots of different ways that you can use these things in deals. Okay, that's the London season phase. It is probably the game's most important phase. It's where the victory points are scored. At the end of the London season phase, any newly retired family members over here get tapped to show that they're no longer new. They're no longer the new kid on the block. And then we proceed to the next phase of the game. This phase is the family phase. The family phase begins with all players gathering children. Now, the way you always get at least 1 child, and you'll notice that families have this pool of children right here. They all have their own picture, but they're all the same. They all represent 1 family member. You always get 1. If you're playing with 3 players, on odd turns you get 2. If you're playing with 4 to 6 players, you get a second child on even turns. So let's imagine this was the first turn of the game. I would just get this 1 child as the Walsh family. Then, beginning with the player who is chairman, and going clockwise, players will spend all of their children. Now, you don't spend them one at a time. On your turn, if you had 2 children, you would spend both children. And then, so this phase is always 1 round of activity. Now, there are 3 things that you can do with your children. The first thing you can do is you can enlist them in the company. This doesn't cost any money, and you can make them either a writer or an officer. Now, there are 3 writers. There are 3 places where writers can go in the game, and when you choose to make them a writer, you get to choose if you want them to go in this box, or this box. These different boxes are associated with the game's 3 presidencies, and we'll put them in line for promotion up to the offices available in that presidency and for business opportunities in that part of India. You can also enlist your child in the army, in the East India Company's army. And to do that, you put your child on the officers in training box. So basically, the enlist action allows them to become a writer or allows them to become an officer. Now, that's one thing you can do. Another thing you can do is you can buy a deed. Now, when you buy a deed, it costs the child. So the child is essentially converted into one of these mini Euro cards. And there are 3 different things you can convert your children into. You could make them into shipbuilders, and you could buy a shipyard. When you buy a shipyard, you take the shipyard, and then you also take the matching ship. And on TTS, these stacks are in order, so it's pretty easy to just pull the top from each. So here, the shipyard is the Diligence. Comes with the Diligence as a ship. You'll note that all the deeds have prices listed in a little ribbon, just like this ribbon. So the shipyards cost 3, luxuries cost 6, workshops cost a variable amount, which we'll talk about in a second. The shipyards, they come with a ship, and what that means is that you've built the ship, but it has not been provisioned and fit yet. So like it still needs its sails, it needs its food, and it also, of course, needs its goods. Later in the game, the company will lease these ships. They will pay money to have them fitted, and once the ship is fitted, shipyards will earn a steady income. Okay, let's look at the other deeds. And also shipyards give you 1 political power. They give you 1 vote, which we'll talk about votes later. So luxuries, here we have some luxuries. Luxuries give you nothing except 2 victory points, and they may also have some other fringe benefits depending on how the game goes. We'll get into that later. And then you have workshops. Now workshops have a variable cost, they're worth a vote, and they also have a variable income. Workshops cost as much as indicated on this chart. So for example, at the start of the game, workshops cost 3. Now, as workshops become more profitable, they're going to cost more money. If they become less profitable, they cost less money. All right, that's how workshops work. Now, in general, shipyards are good for the company. The company loves to see people buying shipyards and helping with the trade. Luxuries are good if you're rich and you just want victory points and to win the game. And workshops are an anti-company hedge. If you don't want the company to do well, workshops will allow you to make money when the company does badly. Okay, so those are the 3 deeds. Now, the last thing you can do with your child is you can send them off to the stock exchange. Now, the stock exchange is this series of spots here. You'll note that they have different costs listed on them. And the cost is what's paid when you add your family member to the stock exchange. You can place your family member on any spot as long as it's empty and you have the money to pay for it. And by the way, whenever I'm talking about money being paid for, this money is going to the bank. So you can put it the 2, either of the 3s, the 4, or the 5. You don't have to fill it up in any particular order. All right, so we'll put our family member here, for instance, as an example. All right, now next, after the family phase is over, we go to the private firm phase. This is skipped until the company deregulates, so I won't be going over it in this video. All right, then we move to the stock buys phase. The stock buys phase has 3 steps. The first step is we check share creation. If there is a family member in the top of this chart and there is no debt, it automatically becomes a share. All right, and so that's not the case here, so we move on to the second step, which is buy debt. If the company has any debt, let's say the company in this instance has 2 debt, for each debt, we remove the debt. For each debt and for each family member in the stock exchange, we remove the debt and take the top family member and move them into the share box. If debt remains, it just remains. And if there's no debt and there are people that just remain, the people remain. And then the third phase is share appreciation. So let's say there was no debt and I had put my piece here. The final phase of stock buys is that my portfolio increases in value and all the pieces slide up to the top, maintaining their relative order. All right, that's the stock buy phase. Now we're going to do hiring. In the hiring phase, we organize this stack of cards by number from the lowest number to the highest number. Here we have the number 2. This is the only one in the stack right now. And we resolve each vacancy in the order. So note that on this card, we have the Director of Trade is chosen by the chairman. The candidate pool is all officers except governors or the chairman. If none, consider writers. So here's the Director of Trade. You can see that it's empty. And the people who can fill this job are basically anybody else on this line. So any of these officers could fill that spot. Now, the chairman has to choose. So yellow has to choose, and they can choose between green, yellow, or blue. Now, yellow is allowed to pick themselves. However, they must observe the nepotism rule. And the nepotism rule works like this. You can never pick yourself unless all people that you're passing up, all other candidates, consent. So yellow might really want to promote himself to this position. If that was the case, they would need the permission of green and blue. If blue decides to hold out, then they have to choose between green and blue. When that happens, we move the piece up. And if a player was promoted from another office, that player must immediately appoint a successor. So if blue was appointed to this position, they have to immediately hire one of the people who would be qualified for their job. So for instance, that's the Madras Presidency. So I'll go find the Madras Presidency card, which is over here. So let's say blue gets the position. On the back of the Madras Presidency, it notes that candidates are writers and governors associated with this presidency. Currently, this presidency has no governors and just 2 writers. So blue would have to pick either of these 2 players. They can't pick themselves unless green gives them permission. If green holds out, green will end up with the Madras Presidency. And then this card is given to green, and the Director of Trade is given to blue. So this continues until all the company positions are hired, and all the hiring pretty much follows that procedure with one exception. The one exception is the chairman. So the chairman card over here, you'll see, let's imagine that the chairman was vacant. The chairman is chosen by the court of directors through an election. And the candidate pool is any share in the court of directors. So here we have the court of directors. These are all shares in the company. They represent big blocks of shares. And they need to figure out who is going to be their next chairman. Now, in order to become a chairman, if you have a share, you kind of announce your candidacy, and you become chairman as long as you have the consent of over half of the shares in the company. So for blue, so there are 5 shares in this company right now. For blue, here, we'll take that off so we don't get distracted. Not distracted, confused, because this share would have grown. Actually, here, we'll do it this way. Imagine that this share had been bought and added. So there are 6 shares in the court of directors. In order for one of these shares to become president, they need the consent of 4. That's a majority of 6. Now, so in order to do that, let's say yellow wants to be the new director. They need either blue or green to agree. The moment that they have that consent, the election is over. Now, this phase is done in real time. Basically, anybody who wants their candidacy just starts seeking support. And as soon as one player has it, they say that they've had it. And if they have it and all the consent is lined up and verified by the other players, the election's over. So for instance, in this instance, like yellow really badly wants it. Maybe green wants it too. Green can only become the chairman if they get the support of yellow. So maybe these 2 are locked. And maybe blue also really wants it, but blue also needs the support of yellow. Yellow would need the support of either of these 2 players. And maybe yellow and blue work out a deal where yellow will end up being chairman, but blue will get some other kind of fringe benefit. When the chairman election is over, let's say in this instance blue consents, one of the yellow shares is moved down to the chairman slot. And then there is a bonus. This job is very hard to get. And the bonus is you take whatever the top card is from the prestige deck. So here's the prestige deck. You reveal that you became the chairman. You just take the top card from the prestige deck and you flip it over, and maybe there's a little spouse was married into your family because you were successful. This would go to yellow in this instance. Okay. Now, I didn't mention, sorry. My bad. At the end of this step, this market is always filled back to 3. So, for instance, that other card would have been out here in the display. We would always draw from the top of the deck. Apologies for that. Okay, so anyway, there you go. You have the election of the chairman. All right, now, if a job can't be filled because there are no candidates, it will just remain empty, and it is skipped during this next phase, which sometimes happens. All right, we have progressed through hiring, and we are now going to go on to the resolution of the turn. Now, I want you to note that on this in this procedure, the first several turns are mostly like your family. We're thinking a lot about your family. And then in the middle part of every turn, we resolve the action of the company. And then in the back end of the turn is going to be a mixture of like world events that you have to deal with and some upkeep. Okay, so now we're going to start going through all the different positions. Now, every office in this game every office has a card associated with it. So, for instance, where'd the chairman go? I lost my chairman card. Oh, here it is. Okay, so every office in the game has a card associated with it. This card is sort of a play aid. Like it holds your fatigue, of course, but also it's just a play aid. So, for example, we start here with the chairman, and we can refer to the chairman card, which will tell you what you do. So, the chairman is responsible for money. You'll note that the company has 5 treasuries associated with 5 of its offices, and the chairman gets to decide where the new money goes. So, the chairman has 2 things that they do. The first thing they do is they seek debt. The way they seek debt is they need the consent of at least half of the court of directors. So whereas a chairman election requires a majority, seeking debt just requires half. So in this instance, there are 5 shares, and they would need the consent of 3 of those 5 shares in order to take out any debt. So for example, they would say, I would like to take 2 debt. And if nobody agrees, then they could adjust what they're saying and say, I would like to take out a single debt. And maybe blue says, yes, that sounds fine. And as soon as that happens, we add 1 debt to the company standing. And then for every debt added, and the chairman can take up to, the maximum number of debt, they can't force the company to fail because they can only take debt equal to the remainder of the line of credit. So let's imagine that they take 1 debt here. For every debt taken, the company balance is increased by £5. After they've taken debt, they can allocate this company balance to any of these treasuries. The Director of Trade's treasury is used for trade envoys. The Shipping's treasury is used to buy ships and shipyards. The presidential treasuries are used to purchase local alliances and also to make trade attempts. So the chairman will go about their turn and they will direct some money around. Now, there's no limit on these treasuries of how much they can hold, with the exception of the Director of Trade that can only hold up to £6. We'll put 4 in it for sake of example. All right, that's the chairman's turn. Now we move on to the Director of Trade. Now, the Director of Trade has 2 responsibilities. Here, I'll put their card on the table so you can see it. The Director of Trade has 2 responsibilities. The first responsibility is they have a special envoy. Now, the special envoy is a trade mission that they can use to uncover different orders in India, which makes them open. They can also use it to open the China office, which we'll talk about in a little bit. After they finish with their special envoy, they can take the transfer action, which allows them to shift pieces around. All right, let's talk about the special envoy first. The special envoy is an action. Now, actions are, in John Company, any action that involves India is usually risky, and so you have to roll dice to see if the action succeeds. The dice system is generally, we use the same dice system for every action. Here's how it works. You are going to, using this little chart, see that every dice you want to roll costs £1. So the special envoy could roll 1, 2, 3 dice, like this, 1, 2, 3. And then some actions have to pay a penalty, and that penalty is listed in the right box. In this case, the special envoy's action says none. Okay, so once you've gathered your dice, you roll them, and you only use the lowest roll. In this case, the lowest roll is 3. And the results are as follows. A 1 or 2 means that the action was successful. A 3 or 4 means that it was a kind of null, like nothing happens, except that the money was spent, of course. And if you wanted to continue acting, you're welcome to try again and spend more money to take the action again. If the roll was a 5 or a 6, the action is a catastrophic failure. And catastrophic failures mean that whoever was holding that office, they are immediately removed from their position and returned to the family's supply. So let's say the Director of Trade had made this roll, they would be immediately removed. And the office becomes vacant, and we put it on the vacant offices box. In general, that's a horrible thing to have happen to you. So don't do it. All right, let's go on to shipping. Now, shipping is a junior position. And one of the ways that its juniorness is expressed is the fact that if you are the shipping officer, you have to spend down. You can only have at most £2 remaining in your office's treasury. So if your boss man allocates a lot of money to shipping, you've got to spend it. You can't just like hide it for yourself or for a future turn. Now, there are 3 things you can spend your money on. You can spend £3 to fit a ship. And to do that, if a player owns a shipyard that has a ship on it, or if there is a ship on any shipyard like this, you could spend £3, 1, 2, 3, from that treasury to put that ship on any of the 3 sea zones in the game. So we could do it like that. Now, if all the ships are fitted, you also have the option to buy a company-financed shipyard, which you'll just put over here, kind of on the side of the board. And this just becomes another shipyard. This is the Eliza, becomes another shipyard like any other shipyard, which can be fitted on future turns or even on this turn if you have enough remaining money. But you can only buy new company shipyards if every ship has already been fitted. Finally, you can purchase extra ships. Extra ships only cost £2. They're these little red ships. And extra ships represent short-term leases. So like here, the Diligence here is on a long-term lease. So is the Atlas. If an extra ship is on a short-term lease, it is useful only for that single turn. Oh, you know what? I just skipped a phase. So I'm going to go backwards a little bit. Apologies. So let's rewind. Go back to the Director of Trade. I didn't explain the Director of Trade's transfer. The Director of Trade has a transfer. They can make up to 2 transfers. Each transfer can move 1 rider or ship from one presidency to another. So I can move this rider from here to here. I can move a ship from here to here. I can move 2 ships. Oops. I can move 2 riders. You're welcome to move extra ships. Anything like that. Okay. So, sorry. Now the Director of Trade's done. I didn't talk about the transfer because they catastrophically failed their action, which means they wouldn't have been able to take the transfer action. Okay. So we have the shipping office, and we've gone through all the different choices. Remember that any ship that you fit, the shipping office gets to choose where they go. Now, why do you want to put ships in places? Ships represent trade bandwidth. So the number of ships in a sea zone represents how many orders can be filled. Now, orders are these circles with numbers in them. So for example, here in the Bengal Presidency, the constant friend is only 1 ship, so they can only fill 1 order. Likewise, in Madras, only 1 order could be filled. In the Western Indian, this is the Arabian Sea, they could fill up to 3 orders. Now, it's worth noting that these orders it's worth noting that there are 3 ships here, but only 2 orders could be filled because there's only 2 spots here. Now, how do you deal with those other things? So that actually brings me back to our friend, the Director of Trade, which I explained very poorly, and I apologize for it. So I talked about the Special Envoy, but I don't think I really explained well what the Special Envoy can do. So the Special Envoy can be used to open. So you always pick a target when you pick a Special Envoy, and you can open 1 order on the board. That means removing any one of these black discs and making the order available for trade. Or you can create the China office. Now, if you create the China, you have to declare the target before rolling. And if you choose to create the China office, what you do is you go over here and you grab the little China office placard, which sits right there. And then you take the China office, here he is, the super fresh-faced superintendent of trade in China, and you create this vacant office, which is immediately filled upon its creation. And then so you would like hire it right away if it's filled, and then it goes and sits in that sits in that spot. Okay, whew, sorry about that. This is, the Director of Trade catastrophically failed, and I just stopped explaining how they work. My bad. Okay, so now we go on to military affairs. So the way the Military Affairs Office works is we can look at our little reference card here. The Military Affairs Office, the first thing they do is they can transfer officers. And each one, yes, let me actually check a thing, because I want to make sure, I have to make sure that this explanation lines up with the current rules and not the slightly different versions that are floating out there. The Military Affairs Office can transfer officers or regiments. So the way that works is right here, these 3 black pieces are regiments, which represent, blocks of military power. And the Military Affairs Office can make up to 2 transfers. So they could move both regiments here if they wanted to. They could do other allocations. Each transfer moves 1 regiment or 1 officer from one box to another. An officer is a player piece that exists in one of these boxes on the top half. These player pieces on the left do not count as officers. They're called commanders, and they stay put at this moment. So I could, for instance, with my 2 transfers, move both of these officers up here to Bombay. Okay. So the next thing you do after you do your officer transfer is you get to assign new officers. So let's put some new officers in play. Let's imagine that these 2 officers were sitting in training. I have to, actually here, we'll do it like that. So imagine this was a turn where green had 2 children for some reason, and there are many ways that can happen. During this step, I get to assign these officers in training to any of the 3 armies, so I could put both of them here. And the last step is I assign commanders. And the way the commanders work is if one player who isn't the commander has more total pieces in this box than the commander gets demoted into an officer, and then the new player gets promoted to that position. So becoming a commander is simply a matter of having the most pieces. Now, if there's a tie, let's say it was like this, nothing changes because you need more. Blue needs more pieces. However, if this commander was vacant and it was like this, green would be able to select either green or blue to hold this position. Now, it's worth noting that even though this is a selecting, it's not hiring, which means the nepotism rule does not affect. There can be plenty of nepotism in the army. Ooh, all right, that's the military affairs. So we have, let's say, well, for the sake of example, we're going to put the pieces like this. Okay, now, after that, we proceed on to the presidencies. So the presidencies have 3 different steps. They have this governor step, which will be skipped on the first turn. I'll talk about it later. And then we move on to the associated commander. So this is the commander of the Army of Bombay, so yellow gets to act. And then after the commander acts, we'll go to the president, which is also yellow in this instance. Now, what do commanders do? Well, commanders have a number of things. The first thing they do is they can seek local alliances. So every army, you'll see, has 2 or 3 local alliances associated with them. So here in Army of Bombay, we have the Sikhs in Rajasthan that we can that we can solicit. Now, these pieces are on the board. Here's Rajasthan, here's the Sikhs, and they have a cost associated with them. Now, commanders don't have any budget for themselves, but they can ask the president to buy them the alliance. So, for instance, if the Army of Bombay wanted the Sikhs, they could ask the president could say yes or no. Let's say they say yes. They spend £3, and then the Sikhs are added to the army box. Now, what this army represents is it has a strength of 2, and the armies are only going to be good for 1 turn, and then they go back to the board during the cleanup step. So currently the Army of Bombay has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strength. All right, now what can a commander do with all that strength? Well, commanders have 2 different actions. They have the invasion action and they have the open orders action. The open orders action is used to open orders just like this. So for instance, the Army of Bombay can tap a number of military strength. So in this instance, I'm tapping 2 to roll 2 dice to open orders. All right. And this works like any other action. You roll dice equal to the strength. There's no penalty so far. If you're successful, you clear all of the open orders. So all the closed orders become open, rather. Okay, 1 second. Now, in this instance, that order was a total failure, which is a big bummer. Army of Bombay is bummed out. If they were successful, every piece they tapped and the commander would make £1 as a small looting bonus. Okay, now what's the other action? Their other action is the invasion action. Now, the invasion action, for every strength piece that you tap, like follows, like I'm doing here, adds a die. So in this instance, the Sikhs have already been used, so we're not going to worry about them. But I tapped 4 additional points of strength, so I'm going to be rolling 4 dice. But this is modified, you'll see, by the defense of the region, which is that little shield in the X. And the defense of the region is its strength. So you'll see that the region of Bombay has it's level 1. Its size is level 1. As 1 level of tower. And if I turn on the UI here, you can see there's a little tooltip that comes up that will show you its strength. So that means we lose 1 die. Now, some regions you'll see have little flags on them. These regions are affiliated with an empire. And if you're attacking them, you have to add up all of their strength. So if someone was attacking Maratha, for instance, it would have a strength of 1, 2, 3, and then Punjab doesn't add anything because it has 0 strength right now. So all 3 of these would add up to be the same. Okay, so in this instance, attacking Bombay is a 3-die affair. Let's roll the dice and imagine that we were successful. A very narrow success. If it's successful, there are a few things that happen. So the first thing that happens is the army that was successful gets to roll for loot. Bombay has a loot value of 2. That is seen with these 2 green squares. So we roll 2 of the loot dice, and you just take the high roll. In this case, the high roll was 1, so only 1 loot is generated, and every player that participated in the attack gets 1 loot per piece. So the commander gets 1, this officer gets 1, and this player gets 1. So yellow would take £2, and blue would take 1. So again, you roll a number of dice equal to the region. You only use the high result. Now, this die has a 1 on it. It has a 2 on it as well. And it also has, let me get to that face. There we go. It also has a 3 and a 0. Now, the 3 and the 0 have a little skull on them. And what this means is that you have to roll for every single officer in the army. And on a 5 or 6, the officer is killed. It's the officer death check. So in this case, blue's officer would be fine, and yellow's officer would also be fine. The loot is only paid out after the officers roll, or after the officers roll to see if they're killed. Now, the commander does not roll to see if it is killed, because I've seen Paths of Glory, and I know that they're not out there on the front line. Okay, last thing relating to how commanders work is that if the roll is a catastrophic failure, yikes, so bad. If the commander rolls quite bad, what happens then is not only does the invasion not succeed, the commander is demoted to an officer immediately, and then they must make a death check. Everybody must make a death check. In fact, any failed military attack will force a death check. Also, when you're making a death check, you don't bother rolling for local alliances since they're going to go back to the board anyway, but you do roll for regiments, and regiments are removed on 5s and 6s. Okay. Well, that's all the material relating to the commanders. The commanders are like one of the hardest parts of the game. So if it sounded like I just dumped like a metric ton of rules on you, it's because I did. And we have a big example in the rules that shows you how they work. Okay, so that's the commander step right here, and then we go on to the presidency. Now, the presidencies are very powerful offices that only have a single action, and so it's pretty easy to explain. Here's the Presidency of Bombay's action card. You'll see that they have a trade action starting in Bombay. Now, the way trade works is they have to declare the number of regions that they want to trade to, and they declare the number of regions outside of their home territory. So, for instance, if you're just trading to Bombay, you don't need to declare anything. If that order was open, they could declare they're trading to Bombay and Delhi. And for every region that is outside of your home regions, you lose 1 die. So in this case, they could spend 2 dice to get, they spend $2 to get 2 dice in their pool. And if they wanted to trade in Delhi, they would have to remove 1 die. Not the best news. One thing I'll say about this is that presidencies are not compelled to take actions. You do not have to trade if you don't want to. But in this instance, let's say that they want to roll 2 dice and they're just going to trade here. Now, the way trading works is same as ever. They roll those dice and they rolled a 2 as their best roll, so they are successful in their trade. They're only licensed to trade in Bombay because they didn't take that penalty. And they start filling orders. They can fill as many orders as there are ships in the region. For each order, the first order has to be in the heavy black outlined home port. And then every additional order has to be adjacent to an order that was previously filled. So for instance, this would be legal. You mark filled orders by putting riders on the board. If you are out of riders, let's say they had been very risky and wanted to trade in Delhi too, and they were successful on that roll. They have 3 ships, so they can certainly fill these 3 orders, but they don't have a rider for this last order. When that's the case, you just use one of these generic riders to mark that the order is filled. Now, that for each order filled, they add money to the company's balance. 5 for the first, 3 for the second, and 3 for the last one, for a total of £11, which they manipulate. They mark by manipulating the company balance marker. Okay, so at the end of their turn, you will note that the presidents, here's our president, they have these 2 little light green boxes on their card. The first one says that they gain £1 for each completed order. So the presidents get a bonus. They completed this president completed 3 orders, which means they would get £3 in bonuses. The second type of bonus they get is that every rider makes £1 for being placed. So for example, this blue rider makes a single pound, and this yellow rider makes a single pound. So in this instance, the president of Bombay would make £3 for completing 3, plus an additional pound for putting their rider out. Now, when it comes to choosing which rider you put out, the nepotism rule isn't in effect. Nepotism only affects hiring. Okay, that is how the presidents work. Now, one of the nice things about this game, one of the merciful things about this game, is that this block of actions, the presidencies, the commanders, the governors, all this stuff, they're all the same. So the Bombay presidency is based here, but its actions are the same as the Madras presidency and the Bengal. So we get to fast forward our little track right along here. Now, the one office that I haven't explained yet is the governorship. So let's say Bombay was successfully conquered. Now, if Bombay was successfully conquered, so we're going to rewind time a little bit. You remove the tower. It goes off to the side of the board. And if you're using TTS and you have to manipulate the towers, there's a handy little right-click menu that we have in the game that allows you to make them taller and shorter and give them different empire affiliations and things like that. In the actual game, they'll just be pieces that will stack, and then we have little metal flags that go on the domes. So when you conquer a region, the dome is removed, and we go over here. So there are chits that match all the regions. Here's the Bombay chit, and then there's a deck of cards that are all the different governors. So here's the governor of Bombay. Now, when you conquer Bombay, you create essentially a new little state inside India that is managed by the company. And so we put this little marker on this track on the leftmost spot. And if any other provinces are conquered by this army, they'll go in a line. So the offices always act in the order of their creation. This governorship becomes vacant. It will be filled next turn. And when it is filled, the player who takes that job will governorships are filled by officers in the army or riders. Let's imagine this rider got the job. They would put their piece right where the tower used to be. So this is an installed governor. Now, what we'll probably end up doing in the published game is having a little a building or something that the governorships can sit on, so it's obvious when a place is an active governorship. Okay, so what do governors do? Governors are responsible for commissioning more regiments. They can also build like infrastructure for plantations, which we'll talk about. And the way they work is like this. So first, they put money on the card. Now in TTS, we're using these counters because they're so much easier than the way TTS handles money. And so what I usually do in the real game, you just put money on the card, but in TTS I put a die. So I get 3 pounds on the Governor of Bombay minus the chaos on the card. Sorry, not on the card. Minus chaos on this card. It should be minus chaos in this region. I'll fix that in your version. My bad. So there is, for instance, in Bombay, 1 closed order. So the amount of money put on the Governor of Bombay is 2 pounds. Then, in order, they can use this money. They could request more money from the president. So the Bombay president doesn't have any money to give them, but let's say they had 3. Maybe the Bombay presidency wants to give them $1. So you would subtract it here, add it here. Now, with this money, they can take checks, and those checks can be used to build regiments or plantations. Now, with regiments, the way they work is you have to, every dollar you spend is a die. If you're successful, you add a new black chip to the army. The plantations, which represent big irrigation and cash crops. Basically, what you're doing with these is you're orienting the domestic market in that region into an export market. And right now, it might be some combination of import and export. So here's a plantation piece, and you set it on one of the region's orders. Now, some orders, it will not change the value of, like this 5 will just remain 5. Other orders, like this 3, become a 5, which is great. Now, plantations have a few important impacts on the game. One impact is that they increase the strength of rebellions in this region. So Bombay now has a +1 rebellion on it, which means that its rebellions are stronger. The other thing they do, though, is at the end of a governor's turn, they get $1 or 1 pound as a bonus, +1 for every plantation in the region. So every plantation you build is going to increase your bonus, which is a good thing. Now, if you had any money left, like let's say you only spent 2 to build that plantation, you got lucky and you had a single $1 left, that $1 is sent back to the presidency. So even if the governors don't act, all of their tax revenue is directed in towards the presidency, and they can give the presidency some different options. Okay, anyway, that's how governors work. Okay, so after we finish all of these phases, we move on to the bonuses phase. Now, the bonuses phase is where we collect bonuses for any workshops that are on the board and any shipyards that are on the board. Workshop bonuses work like this. So you look at how much money the company made. So let's say the company only made 11 pounds this turn. That means that every workshop, we're in this band, so every workshop makes 2 pounds. Then, after the workshops have made money, we look to see if we need to adjust the factory cost or the workshop cost. So we'll see that, oh, look, workshops made 2 pounds this turn. That means the workshop cost is now 4. So they got a little bit more expensive. Okay, that's how workshop bonuses work. Shipyard bonuses are very simple. For every shipyard you have that's been fitted, so here the Hastings family owns the Diligence, the Britannia, and the Constant Friend. All 3 have been fitted, so they're going to generate a pound for each of those 3 ships. So they'll get 3 pounds from the bank as their bonus. Now, this special bonuses refers to certain prestige cards give players access to special bonuses, and this text just reminds you that there are special bonuses. Okay, let's talk about the envoy to China. So we talked about how the director of trade can possibly create the envoy to China. Here he is, this little fresh boy. Here's the superintendent of trade in China. Now, this office works a little bit differently than other offices in the game. So the director of trade in the shipping office can put ships on it. Ships go in 2 places. They can either be active or exhausted. And the way this works is the player, who is the superintendent of trade in China, we'll put this person there, they can take the trade in China action. And you'll note right here it says that they get a die for every boat. And what does that mean? It means every boat that you exhaust here allows you to get a die. So let's say I'm going to exhaust 2 dice. 2 boats. I roll those dice, and let's say I'm successful. So if I'm successful, the company gains 4 pounds for each plantation. So there's only one plantation right now, so they will gain just 4 pounds. And then, as a bonus, the Superintendent of Trade in China gets 1 pound for each plantation and each unused ship here if I successfully trade it. So the yellow's bonus would be 1 pound for this plantation and an additional pound for this unused ship, for this active ship. And what that means is that they used some of the fleet to move. This is probably, it could be cotton or opium or different things depending on the date. Tea sometimes. So some of the ships that are going to be used to do that, but then other ships are just going to be used to make money, probably importing porcelain into the British Isles and getting some personal graft on it. All right, let's go to the revenue phase. So in the revenue phase, we have to, the company has to pay its expenses. So the company has 3 expenses. They have to pay for ships in their service that they have leased. They need to pay for their army, and they need to pay for their debt. Every ship costs 1 pound, including extra ships. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In this instance, there's 5 ships that need upkeep, so we lower our expenses by 5. Then we do our army upkeep. Every player piece, so don't include local alliances, don't include regiments. Every player piece costs 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there are 6 spent in army upkeep. Yikes. And then we have 1 debt currently, and every debt you need to spend 1 to pay debt service, to pay the interest on the debt. Okay. So that's that. Then after that, the chairman may choose to pay dividends. Each dividend costs 1 pound per share. So we have 5 shares in the court of directors, which means the dividends will cost 5 pounds. Pretty easy. You can pay multiple dividends, and when you pay a dividend, each share makes $1. So in this instance, a dividend would mean 1 for blue, 2 for green, 2 for yellow. Now, in looking over here at our sad company balance, we only have 3 pounds, so we can't pay any dividends. Now, depending on the number of dividends, the company's standing is going to be adjusted. If you paid 1 dividend, it doesn't move. If you paid 2 or more dividends, it advances 1 spot to the right, which is good. And then if you paid no dividends, which is what we did, we lower the company standing by one space. If this company standing is at the maximum spot of the track, it just stays there. It can't advance and fail the company with its good standing. If the standing does fall here, then the company will fail. Now, if we didn't have enough money to pay our expenses, the company would take emergency loans until all expenses are paid. Any additional money would go to any remainder after paying expenses would go directly to the company balance. If you took at least 1 emergency loan, the company standing drops an additional spot. Emergency loans are the only way the company can fail on debt. Okay, that's the revenue phase. How are we doing on time? Okay, we're about an hour in. This makes sense. So I just want to take a quick break here to say a couple of things before I talk about the last 2 phases of the game. Talking through all of these phases and with examples takes about as long as it takes to just play through the first turn in a teaching game. So when I'm teaching a game, I usually expect that the first turn of the game is going to be about 45 minutes to an hour, depending on how much I want to hold the hands of my players, right? At the end of that time, everyone's usually ready to go. And because the info dump it takes to teach players this game takes about an hour, I think usually it makes more sense to just say hey, I'm going to help you through your first turn. We're going to start playing right away. And in an hour, you're going to know everything about how the game works, or almost everything, and we can start going. Because otherwise, if you do just a full info dump, it's going to take about the same amount of time anyway. And then that first turn will also be very long because players need to really internalize what's going on. Okay, let's talk about the last 2 phases of the game. These are the Events in India phase and the Parliament Meets phase. So the Events in India phase starts with the roll of the India die. And this die has a number, and sometimes it also has a storm value. If there's a storm, you have to roll a die for every ship at sea in that storm. And on a 1 or 2, it's healthy. On a 3 or 4, it becomes fatigued. And on a 5 or 6, it's destroyed. So here, the constant friend, it's been sunk at sea. In which case, we would return it to its matching shipyard. and that ship could be refitted. So the shipyard is not destroyed. It's rebuilt at home. It's the constant friend 2, but it does need to be refitted. Now, if you roll fatigue, so if you roll 3 or 4, the ship flips to its fatigue side. If this ship is fatigued again, it's lost. Okay. Right. So now we do the events in India after we do storms. I'll say too that one of these sides, this one, has 3 storm clouds on it. That means storms happen in all 3 zones. Yikes. Be careful about that one. Then we're going to resolve a number of events in India. So the way this works is, let's say there are 2 events in India. That means we need to flip 2 of these event tiles. So when you flip it, the event pictured on the left happens in the event on the right. It happens in the place on the right. So this is the turmoil event, which closes orders. And so we take a closed order token and we want to put it on this order in the Punjab. Now, if you always go to the northernmost open order. So let's say this close order event had happened in Bengal, you would put it on the 5, and then if the 5 was already closed, you'd put it on the 6. So you always start northernmost. So in Maratha, you go 4, and then you'd go to the 2 since this one's already closed. Now, if all orders are closed, there is a cascade event, which means you put a closed order token on every adjacent order, like this. Yikes. Cascades cannot trigger further cascades. So like if Punjab were to reveal this event again, we don't add any additional closed order tokens. This is just locked up. Okay, that's the turmoil event. Let's talk about some of the other events. Here's the leader event. This leader event occurs in Bengal, and all it is plus tower. You just right click and you make the tower 1 step taller. This just means Bengal got a little stronger. Now, you'll note that here at the bottom, we have this little explosion symbol. What does that mean? Well, that means if you're adding, if you want to add a tower in a region that is controlled by the company, like let's say this region was controlled by the company. So like this was a governor. There was a governor of Bengal. You can't add a level to the tower here. And so what happens instead is there is a revolt with a strength 3. Now, the way revolts work in this game, rebellions work, is that the rebellion hits you with the strength 3, and if the commander can exhaust 3 officers like this, the region is saved. But let's say the commander already spent 2 of the officers and there was just 1 left, then the region falls. Now, region loss has a number of impacts. The first impact is the person who held this job, they're gone, they're dead. They're returned to the player's supply. Then the player who is in command of the army puts their guy down like this, and we then make a death check for all the officers and regiments in the army. And perhaps most importantly, every region lost will lower the standing. The first region lost each turn lowers the standing by 1. If a second region is lost in 1 turn, the second region will cause 2 standing to fall. If you have the very bad unfortune to lose 3 regions in a single turn, you will have a triple standing loss for the 3rd region. So, scary stuff. Anyway, that's how the leader works. Let's go through some other actions. So there's leader, we talked about that. Here's our first crisis. So the way the crisis event works is that depends on the position of the elephant. So this is a -1 strength crisis. And so what we have to do is figure out what's going on here. So the elephant usually will be sitting on a border, and the back of the elephant is the belligerent, and where the elephant's pointing is its target, right? So in this instance, Maratha is getting ready to attack Delhi. Now, they're part of the same empire, and so what this represents is a rebellion. The Marathan revolt, they are wanting to, overtake the old Mughal authority here. Now, we look at the strength. So the Marathan strength is 2 because the tower is too high. And in Delhi, the strength is 1. So they're winning it by default, but the strength is always modified by the crisis card. So in this instance, the attacker is -1 in strength. So this is just 1 versus 1. Defenders win ties. So Delhi is victorious in this instance. Now, the loser always has to lower a strength. So we go shorter by 1, and then the elephant marches after resolving the crisis. So in this case, the elephant marches to Madras. That's the top pictured region. And whenever the elephant marches, we ask ourselves a question. First of all, is Marath dependent? Are they dominated by anybody? If they were dominated by the company, we would just put the elephant right by the governor to show that they were getting ready to revolt against the company. But Maratha in this instance is sovereign. It doesn't have any flag on it, so it will attempt to conquer one of its neighbors. And we look at this crisis token and see that there is a little circle at the bottom right of the crisis card, which means the elephant will be placed right here. Now, what this means is Maratha is getting ready to attack Hyderabad, and it wants to conquer it. All right, let's keep going through the event deck. This is a windfall event. It happens in the Punjab, and what it means is that if there were any riders in the Punjab or Delhi or Bombay, they would make £1 for each rider. So this is just good to be riders if you get a windfall event. All right, turmoil we've already talked about. So in this case, the turmoil would happen in Hyderabad. And so Hyderabad is already closed, which means that it closes all adjacent orders. Ooh, yikes. Now, we only resolved 2 events because that was what was rolled on the dice. But for the sake of example, I'm showing you kind of like most of the event deck. So here's the peace event. Now, the peace event is the reverse of the crisis event. So in this case, we go to wherever the elephant is. And if there are any orders on the border that are closed, they become open. So there's peace between these 2 regions. They open up for trade a little bit. And then both regions gain some strength, just like this. Then the elephant moves. Where does it move? It goes to Mysore. Mysore is sovereign, and the key on that card was the circle. So Mysore thinks about conquering Bombay. That's what they're going to go target. Keeping on with these events, we've talked about the windfall event. The leader event in Mysore would cause Mysore to get even taller. There's a peace event. We know how those work. Here's a crisis event. So I want to talk about this crisis event. This is a +2 crisis. So in this instance, Mysore is attacking Bombay. Mysore has a strength of 2. The crisis is 2, so Mysore is attacking with a strength of 4. So Bombay is owned by the company. Let's see what kind of army we've got. Yikes, we do not have an army to defend Bombay from Mysore, so Mysore is successful. When that happens, this office is eliminated. Now that would lower our standing by 2 if this was the second office that was eliminated. If it was the first office eliminated this turn, it would only lower it by 1. And then, because this was a company office, after we do all the office elimination stuff, we have to add the dome back to the board. Because this is now a new, it's back to control that isn't company control. And Mysore has conquered its first region, which means we will assign Mysore an empire. We'll give it Empire B. And it is the capital of Empire B. And Bombay is an Empire B, and it's dominated. So you'll see the capital has a flag with a little star on it. And the dominated one has a flag without a star, a smaller flag. Now, why the capitals matter is if Mysore were to fall, all of its provinces would break up and they would go back to being independent, sovereign nations. Okay, so that's pretty much all the events. There's a couple of stranger events like the foreign invasion, which is basically like a bad rebellion or invasion that happens from an off-board actor that can just strike anywhere. In this case, it strikes in Maratha. So Maratha would have to fight. Basically attack this region with a crisis of strength of 1d6. So like, a strength of 4 attacks Maratha. And, so then you have to add, 1, 2. In its defense against 4, it fails. So Maratha is going to become part of another nation. This represents, attacks from Persia or the French or other powers who just aren't represented on the board. Could be a big religious movement. There are different ways it could be. Okay, so that takes you through almost all of the other events. There's some subtlety in how the events work and some careful considerations, but I just wanted to give a kind of like big picture of the event so that you could run through it mostly by yourselves. All right, now we go on to the Parliament Meets, the very last stage of the game, which is good because I'm losing my voice. All right, so here's how this works. The way I usually explain this phase to new players is I first explain how voting works in general. And then I talk about how the actual Parliament Meets phase operates. So the way voting works in general is this is a real-time phase. There'll be a law under some consideration. One player holds the prime minister title. This isn't an office, it's a title. It's not associated with any family member, but it's just something that you have. You control the prime minister. The prime minister runs this phase. They will have a proposal that they need to pass, and players will vote on it. Now, the way this works is this is also a phase that's kind of unstructured. It's done sort of real time, where, for instance, if the law is currently at like 2 passing, the prime minister will say like, hey, the law is at 2 passing. Does anyone object to this? Does anyone want to, vote for something, vote against the law? And any player who wants to speak up is welcome to, and they can spend resources to vote. And the way this works is if they want to vote against, every vote they spend lowers this. At 0, it's always passing. And then if it's at 0, they can flip it to 1 and get it up the fail track. And then after this, the prime minister does the same thing and says, hey, the law is now failing. Does anyone want to try to save it? And players can hop in and they can spend their votes to lower the fail track down like here. And if they lower it to 0, it flips back to its passing. And then they can increase it if they'd like. Okay, now how do you spend votes? Well, every dollar you have can be spent as a vote. And if you have votes on your deeds, you can tap the deed. It can only be tapped once per turn to use its vote system right there. So we have 1 vote on the shipyards. The workshops are also worth a vote. Luxuries, you can see, are not worth any votes. Okay, so that's how voting works. Now, one other little rub to the system is that if you vote against the law, you should track the number of votes that you've spent against the law. You can just use dice to track it. It's pretty easy. Or, oftentimes you don't even need dice. It's obvious who's spent the most voting against the law. Now, if a law is successful, the prime minister remains in power and they get to remain prime minister. This is an important thing because it comes with a lot of prestige, which we'll talk about very soon. If the law fails, the player who led the opposition, who had the most opposition votes, they get to take the prime minister card. They yoink it from you. Now, if there's a tie among players who are in the opposition, the player who got there first, who had the most votes first, gets to become the new prime minister. You can track that by using this little leader of the opposition token. So as soon as I vote for, I vote for against, this player does. Even if the Larkins family later votes for against, they don't get this token. Only the first player with that number does. Feel like I'm forgetting something. Oh, the prime minister is never allowed to vote against the proposition. This is the rule called the prime minister's honor. They are always for the proposition. They don't have to vote for it, but they can't vote against it. This is maybe the better way to explain it. Okay. So one other thing about voting is that you can consent to offer other people your votes. So, for example, the Hastings here has got 3 votes, and maybe Larkins really wants to be the next prime minister. Hastings could say, hey, I'm going to tap these votes while you have the floor and give you their voting power to vote for or against the legislation. Okay. We'll talk about negotiations too in a little bit. All right, let me explain now the structure of the parliament phase. So now you all know how voting works generally. Let's talk about what happens. The prime minister is going to reveal a law, and then they can choose to vote on it or not. If they don't want to vote on this law, they can reveal another law. They can do this up to 3 times. And once I reveal army spending, I can choose, do I want to vote on ship subsidy or army spending? Remember, the prime minister only keeps their prime ministership if the law passes. Now, here's writer graft reform, so they can have these 3 different proposals. Now, every law out here has a number of things. It has a support value, which is how its status currently, so most of them are going to start failing to some degree. And then some have, and all of them have a policy implication, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Now, you can reveal up to 3 cards. However, if you reveal a card, I'm going to find one here, that is a dilemma with the red, you have to select it. You can't select either of these options. So if this is the 3rd card I drew, I have to select old ideas made new, which means that I need to pick a card from the discard pile. Okay, so let's say these are my laws out here. Let's talk about, let's choose 2 that contrast better, like these. Okay, so let's do ship subsidy first. So ship subsidy says fitting ships now costs £2 instead of 3 for the first 3 ships fitted by the shipping office this turn. That's a great thing. I mean, ships are cheaper for the company. Who would be against such a thing? Well, this law has a policy implication of taxation. So there are 3 policies. There are taxation, which is the -1 symbol with a heavy black circle. There is a bonus symbol, which is the +1, which you can see in the lighter circle. And there's also prestige, which is right here. You'll also note that every one of these policy symbols is yoked to a type of deed, some or a share. So some are yoked to luxuries. Some are yoked to shipyards, like this anchor here. Some are yoked to workshops, which you can see here. And this little heart right here, this little East India Company heart, represents a share of the company's of the company's fortune. So the way this works is if the Prime Minister selects this law, the other gets discarded, and they have to immediately pick a policy. Now, the way this works is there's always a policy proposal, and they have to swing it either clockwise or counterclockwise. So if we go counterclockwise, you have to stop at the first symbol that matches. So the policy symbol is a tax. So I can say, hey, I want to tax shipyards. Or they could go clockwise and say, I want to tax shares. They have to do one or the other. So basically, this is a ship subsidy. This is making fitting ships cheaper. Someone's got to pay for it. Who's going to pay for it? The Prime Minister gets to choose, do I want the shipyards to pay for their own subsidy? Or do I want the shares to pay for their own subsidy? So let's say, for the sake of example, they choose shares. Now we go through a big election. If the election is successful, this law is locked. It will stay in play for the rest of the game. And every person with a share needs to pay £1 for each share. If they can't do it, they lose the share. So scary. If this law fails, the leader of the opposition enacts an adjacent policy. So if this law fails, maybe the shipyard lobby got together and they're like, we don't want it anyway. And they could either choose to tax the workshops or to give shipyards a prestige. Now, we've talked about what taxation is. It's pretty obvious. Bonuses are just that you make £1 per thing that you have that matches it. The prestige is a little different. So if, let's say, this policy were enacted, the shipyard prestige policy, that means that you remove the bottom prestige token on the prestige track. You slide them down, and then you add a matching prestige token on it. And what this track means is that deeds at the end of the game are worth the amount of prestige listed. So this means that luxuries are worth 1 prestige for each luxury. Shipyards are worth 2 for each. And then if, let's say it was like this, this would mean that shipyards are worth a prestige, luxuries are worth a prestige, and shares are worth a prestige. Okay. So that's that law. Let's take a look at the writer graft reform. I keep reading this as the great writer reform. The writer graft reform. This means writer bonuses are paid to the company balance track instead. Yikes. So if these writers that get placed on the board don't give their families money, they give money to the company. This has some support. It's passing with 0 support, like that. And it has a prestige policy, which means if the policy track were here, the Prime Minister could either make this so shares are worth prestige or workshops. And the reason why I went so far is I'm going to the first space on the policy track that matches this. So it can be either this one or this one, because you go counterclockwise or clockwise. So you will always have 2 options. And so maybe, this is really bad for writers, but maybe the shareholders don't have a lot of writers and they would be super into this if it passes. All right. Anyway, that's how the Parliament phase works. All the laws that don't get chosen are just put in the discard pile here. And there's a whole set of them. All the laws are different. They do all kinds of things, including creating new offices. So like the Director of Trade can become the Governor General, the Military Affairs Officer can become the Commander in Chief. There's all different kinds of things that they can do in the game. All right. So that takes you through the entire game. The one thing I haven't talked about is final scoring, which I'll do right now. At the end of the game, you go through these phases. The first phase is you score shares. If the company is successful, every share is worth a victory point. If the company is not successful, every share is minus a victory point. Then we do the prestige award. The player with the most prestige earns 4 victory points. Second most earns 2. And the player or players with the lowest amount lose -3. If there is a tie for the most victory prestige points, all tied players take 2 victory points and no other victory points are awarded, but the players with the lowest will be penalized. In the 3-player game, I believe that you do not use the second place finish. Okay, then one thing about calculating prestige. So enterprises like the Rotten Borough here, you'll note in the top right that it has a little prestige frame with a tiny little deed symbol with the luxury. What that means is that at the end of the game, this Rotten Borough is worth prestige as if it were a luxury. So in this instance, luxuries are worth a single prestige, which means this card is worth 1 prestige. Some other cards like spouses have fixed prestige amounts, like Violet Effingham here. She's worth 3 prestige. Okay. After that, if the company was successful, we do a special final retirement. This retirement is a little bit different. It starts with attrition. There is a retirement with no prestige card draws. And then you pay upkeep, which means if you score on the last turn, you do have to pay upkeep on it. So it works a little different from the London season. Finally, almost finally, we score hidden interests. So if any players had secret prestige cards that were hidden interests, they would now see if they fulfill this condition and then score those victory points. Player with the most victory points wins the game. The tiebreaker is, I always forget, it's the player with the most prestige. If still tied, you have to have a boat race. Okay, no cooking contest yet because I wouldn't subjugate anybody to British food. That's a bad joke. There are some British dishes I like. Maybe you can have a British pub food contest. Okay, so I think that's it. My goodness. Yeah. So this, I hope this gives you a sense of all the different systems. As I told you at the start of the video, it's a lot. This is a big, complicated game, and it is. I think it works best when you teach it in small pieces. And so what I usually tell people when I'm playing the game with them is like, hey, your first turn, I want to hold your hand. I want to take your turn for you. And I'm just going to kind of like explain what I'm doing as I'm doing it. And then it's very training wheels. And then the second turn, we pull the training wheels off and you can ride the dang bicycle. Your first turn, your first game tends to go a little long and then they really do come down. Now, there's one thing I did not talk about, which I should talk about right now, which is that John Company is a negotiation game. And in a negotiation game, especially one like this, you can make all kinds of deals and transfer all kinds of things. Players are allowed to transfer cash if they want. They cannot transfer office holders. These people are stuck where they're at, or like writers. They can transfer shares because these shares represent, they're just pieces of paper. And so the way that works is one player, if green wants to sell a share to blue, green can remove their share piece and blue can add their share piece. As long as the number of shares is staying consistent. You can also promise people your children as wards. I could say, hey, I don't really want this child. I want them to go into your care, in which case that child goes away and a child is gained over here. Okay, and then the other thing that you can transfer are these promise cards. Now, I wanted to save talking about the promise cards for the end because these do different things and they only really make sense once you know the rules of the game. So this one's very easy. This promise card is basically green can give this promise card to another player. And whoever holds this card at any time can redeem this card for £2 or less. If they want. Now, promise cards are freely transferable. So after Hastings buys this promise card from Green, for whatever reason, Hastings could sell this promise card to another player if they wanted to. Okay, so progressing on through the promise cards, we have the £2 or less. Consent for nepotism during hiring. This one can be quite valuable in the late game. and especially on the secondhand market. What this means is if someone turns in this card, you have to let them hire themselves. This one, take an office holder's bonus. So before an office holder takes a bonus, a governor or a president, for instance, the player who has this card can take that bonus instead. This is a child as a ward. So basically, at some point, I told you you could raise my child for me, and you can cash that in whenever you'd like. When the promises are cashed in, they are returned to the player who held them, the Walsh family in this instance. They can then lend them out a second time. And then lastly, we have a prestige card from the London display. Before a player has their turn to select a prestige card, this can be cashed in, and the player who cashed it in will select it instead. Woo! All right. Okay, well, I think this is pretty much everything. I hope you have a good sense of how this game works. And I'm sure I left lots of little things out, but you can find a full rulebook with lots of examples on the Kickstarter page. And we'll also be doing several playthroughs over the course of the campaign. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this game in its teach. This has been a real labor of love for Drew and I. We've been working, I feel like I've been working on John Company forever. The design was first started like almost over a decade ago. And we were really happy with how the first edition turned out. And I am delighted that the second edition has given me a chance to really revisit the design and flesh it out. And I hope you have even half as much fun playing it as we did building it. All right. Well, thank you all and have a wonderful day.